It was a cold, rainy night in the heart of the city. The kind of night where the streets glistened under the dim glow of flickering streetlights, and the air carried a chill that seeped into your bones. The kind of night where most people hurried home, eager to escape the downpour and the darkness. But for one man, this night would change everything. A billionaire, known for his towering skyscrapers and ruthless business deals, was driving through the less fortunate part of town. His sleek black car cut through the rain like a shadow, its headlights illuminating the empty sidewalks. He wasn't supposed to be here. This wasn't his world. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he slowed at a red light, his eyes caught movement near the alleyway. A young girl, no older than 16, was huddled under a torn jacket, her face streaked with dirt and rain. She was shivering, her eyes darting nervously as if expecting danger to emerge from the shadows. Something about her stopped him cold. Maybe it was the way she looked so small against the vast, uncaring city. Maybe it was the flicker of defiance in her eyes, a spark that refused to be extinguished. Whatever it was, he found himself rolling down the window calling out to her. "Hey, are you okay?" His voice was gruff, but there was an edge of concern he hadn't intended to show. The girl hesitated, her gaze narrowing as she studied him. She didn't trust him. Why should she? In her world, trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But the rain was relentless, and she was out of options. "I'm fine," she muttered, though her trembling hands betrayed her. The billionaire sighed, his mind racing. He knew he shouldn't get involved. He had a reputation to uphold, a life that didn't include street kids and their problems. But something about her tugged at him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. "Get in," he said finally, his tone leaving no room for argument. "I'll take you somewhere warm." What followed was a series of events that neither of them could have predicted. As they drove in silence, the girl, her name was Mia, stared out the window, her jaw clenched as if daring the world to break her. The billionaire, whose name was Alexander Grant, stole glances at her, his mind swirling with questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? And why did she seem so familiar? When they arrived at his penthouse, the contrast between their worlds couldn't have been starker. The opulence of his home seemed almost cruel compared to the life Mia had been living. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the art that probably cost more than she could ever imagine. "You live here?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander nodded, though he felt a pang of guilt he couldn't explain. As the night wore on, the tension between them grew. Mia was wary, her guard never fully down. Alexander, on the other hand, found himself drawn to her in ways he couldn't understand. There was something about her spirit, her resilience, that reminded him of someone. But who? It wasn't until hours later, as they sat across from each other in his study, that the truth began to unravel. Mia had been rifling through an old photo album she found on the shelf, her fingers tracing the faces of people she didn't know. Then she froze, her eyes locked on a picture of a young woman, her smile radiant, her eyes filled with hope. Who is this?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. Alexander looked up, his heart skipping a beat as he saw the photo in her hands. That's my ex-wife," he said slowly, his throat tightening. "Why do you ask?" Mia didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph, one she had carried with her for as long as she could remember. It was the same woman, only younger, holding a baby in her arms. A baby with a tiny birthmark on her wrist. The same birthmark Mia had. The room fell silent, the air thick with unspoken words. Alexander's mind raced, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed falling into place. Could it be? Was it possible that this girl, this street kid he had taken in on a whim, was his daughter? The daughter he never knew he had. The daughter his ex-wife had kept from him all these years. Before he could say anything, Mia stood up, her eyes blazing with a mix of anger and hurt. "You abandoned us," she said, her voice shaking. "You left her, and she couldn't handle it. She couldn't handle anything after that." Alexander felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. "Mia, I didn't know," he stammered, but she was already heading for the door. "Wait!" he called out, his voice desperate. But she didn't stop. As the door slammed shut behind her, Alexander was left alone in the silence, his mind reeling. How could he fix this? How could he make things right? And more importantly, would Mia ever give him the chance? The rain continued to fall outside, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the chaos in his heart. Somewhere out there, Mia was disappearing into the night, taking with her the truth of who she was, and who he was to her. Alexander knew he couldn't let her go. Not now. Not after everything. But as he grabbed his coat and headed for the door, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The beginning of a story that would change both of their lives forever. And as the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, one question lingered in the air, unanswered and heavy with possibility. What happens next? Alexander stepped out into the rain, the cold droplets hitting his face like tiny needles. The city was alive around him, but he barely noticed. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions: shock, guilt, confusion, and a desperate need to find Mia. He couldn't let her disappear into the night. Not after what he had just discovered. Not after realizing that the girl he had taken in, the girl who had seemed so lost and alone, was his own flesh and blood. His daughter. The word felt foreign, yet achingly familiar. Like a song he hadn't heard in years, but still remembered every note of. He hurried down the street, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of her. The rain made it harder to see, but he pressed on, driven by a determination he hadn't felt in years. As he walked, his mind drifted back to the past, to the woman in the photograph, Elena. She had been his first love, the kind of love that consumes you, that makes you believe in forever. They had been young, ambitious, and wildly in love. But life had a way of tearing people apart. Their marriage had crumbled under the weight of his ambition, his obsession with building an empire. He had been blind to her struggles, too focused on his own goals to see that she was drowning. And then, one day, she was gone. She had left, without a word, taking with her everything that mattered. He had tried to find her, but she had vanished without a trace, until now. The memory of her face, so full of life in the photograph, haunted him as he searched for Mia. How had he not seen it before? The resemblance was uncanny. The same sharp cheekbones, the same defiant tilt of the chin. Even the way Mia carried herself, with a quiet strength that belied her age, reminded him of Elena. He felt a pang of guilt, sharp and unrelenting. How could he have missed it? How could he have let them slip through his fingers? As he turned a corner, he spotted a figure sitting on a bench under the shelter of a bus stop. It was Mia. Her shoulders were hunched, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if trying to hold herself together. Alexander's heart ached at the sight. She looked so small, so vulnerable. Yet there was a fire in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. He approached her slowly, not wanting to scare her off. "Mia," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the rain. She didn't look up, but he could see her tense. "Please," he continued, "let me explain. Let me make this right." Mia finally turned to look at him, her eyes filled with a mix of anger and pain. "Make it right," she repeated, her voice trembling. "How? By buying me a fancy dinner? By throwing money at me like you do with everything else?" Alexander flinched at her words, but he didn't back down. "No," he said firmly. "By being here. By being your father. The word felt heavy on his tongue, but it also felt right. Mia stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, he thought she might get up and walk away again. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of the world had finally become too much to bear. "You don't get it," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know what it's like to grow up wondering why you weren't enough. Wondering why your own father didn't want you." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to tell her that he had never known, that he would have been there if he had. But the words felt hollow, even to him. Instead, he sat down beside her, the rain still falling around them. "Tell me," he said gently. "Tell me everything." And so, Mia began to speak. She told him about her life on the streets, about the struggles she had faced just to survive. She told him about her mother, about how Elena had tried to give her a good life but had been broken by the weight of her own demons. She spoke of the nights they had spent huddled together in shelters, of the days they had gone without food. And she spoke of the day her mother had left her, promising to come back, but never returning. "I waited for her," Mia said, her voice breaking. "I waited for so long, but she never came back. And now I find out that you're my father. That you could have been there all along." Alexander listened in silence, his heart breaking with every word. He wanted to reach out to her, to pull her into his arms and promise her that everything would be okay. But he knew it wasn't that simple. He had missed so much. Her first steps, her first words, all the moments that made up a childhood. He couldn't just erase that with a few words or a grand gesture. But he could try. He could try to be the father she deserved, even if it was too late. As the rain began to ease, Mia stood up, her eyes still wary but no longer filled with anger. "I don't know if I can trust you," she said quietly. "But I want to. I want to know who you are, who I am." Alexander nodded, his heart swelling with hope. "Then let's start there," he said. "Let's start with getting to know each other." He held out his hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Mia took it. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a beginning. As they walked back to his car, Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the start of a much larger journey. There were still so many questions left unanswered. About Elena, about Mia's life, about how they could possibly bridge the gap between their two worlds. But for the first time in years, Alexander felt a sense of purpose. He had spent his life building an empire, but now he realized that the most important thing he could ever build was a relationship with his daughter. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be challenges, misunderstandings, and moments of doubt. But as he glanced at Mia, her face still guarded but with a flicker of hope in her eyes, he knew it would be worth it. Because sometimes, the most important stories are the ones that begin with a single step into the unknown. And as the city lights reflected in the puddles around them, Alexander couldn't help but wonder where this story would take them next. The drive back to Alexander's penthouse was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with unspoken words. Mia sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed as she stared out the window, her reflection blurred by the rain-streaked glass. Alexander kept his eyes on the road, but his mind was racing. He wanted to say something, to break the tension, but every word that came to mind felt inadequate. How do you start a conversation with a daughter you never knew you had? How do you explain a lifetime of absence? He glanced at her, his chest tightening at the sight of her guarded expression. She was so young, yet she carried herself with a strength that spoke of years of hardship. He couldn't help but wonder how much of that strength came from having to survive on her own. When they arrived at the penthouse, Mia hesitated at the door, her eyes scanning the luxurious space with a mix of awe and discomfort. "This is a lot," she said finally, her voice tinged with unease. Alexander nodded, understanding her hesitation. "It's just a place," he said gently. "It doesn't mean anything unless it feels like home." Mia didn't respond, but she stepped inside, her movements cautious, as if she were afraid to touch anything. Alexander watched her, his heart aching at the way she seemed so out of place in a world that should have been hers all along. Over the next few days, they began to navigate the fragile beginnings of a relationship. It was awkward at first, filled with long silences and tentative conversations. Mia was wary, her walls firmly in place, and Alexander struggled to find the right words to bridge the gap between them. But slowly, they began to open up. Mia told him more about her life on the streets, about the friends she had made, the dangers she had faced, and the dreams she had clung to in the darkest moments. Alexander listened, his admiration for her growing with every story. She was resilient, resourceful, and fiercely independent, qualities he couldn't help but see in himself. But as they grew closer, the shadows of the past began to loom larger. Mia's questions about her mother became more frequent, her voice tinged with a mix of longing and anger. "Why did she leave me?" she asked one evening, her eyes searching Alexander's face for answers. "Why didn't she tell me about you?" Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I promise you, we'll find out together." It was a promise he intended to keep, but he couldn't shake. The feeling that the truth might be more painful than either of them was prepared for. Meanwhile, Alexander's world outside the penthouse began to close in. His business associates, curious about his sudden absence, started asking questions. His assistant, a sharp and loyal woman named Claire, was the first to notice the change in him. "You've been distracted lately," she said one morning, her tone careful but probing. "Is everything okay?" Alexander hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "It's personal," he said finally. Claire raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Still, Alexander knew it was only a matter of time before the rumors started. He had always been a private man, but now, with Mia in his life, he felt exposed in a way he hadn't in years. As the days passed, Mia began to explore the city with a newfound curiosity. Alexander gave her space, knowing she needed time to adjust, but he couldn't help worrying about her. The streets that had been her home were also filled with dangers, and he found himself constantly checking his phone, waiting for her to text him that she was okay. One afternoon, she returned with a small, worn notebook in her hands. "I found this at the shelter," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's my mom's." Alexander's heart skipped a beat as he took the notebook, his fingers brushing against the faded cover. Inside were pages filled with Elena's handwriting, notes, sketches, and fragments of thoughts that painted a picture of a woman struggling to hold herself together. As they read through the notebook together, they began to piece together fragments of Elena's life after she had left Alexander. She had tried to start over, to build a new life for herself and Mia, but the weight of her past had been too much to bear. There were mentions of a man, someone who had promised to help her but had only brought more pain. And then, near the end, a single sentence that made Alexander's blood run cold. "If anything happens to me, find Alexander. He's the only one who can protect her." Mia looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander shook his head, his mind racing. "I don't know," he said, though a part of him feared the worst. "But we'll figure it out. Together." He reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, and for the first time, she didn't pull away. But as they delved deeper into Elena's past, they began to uncover secrets that neither of them had expected. There were names, places, and events that hinted at a life far more complicated than either of them had imagined. And then there was the man, the one Elena had mentioned in her notebook. Who was he? What had he done to her? And why had she been so afraid? The more they uncovered, the more the tension grew. Mia's anger and confusion simmered just beneath the surface, while Alexander's guilt and determination to protect her only intensified. They were standing on the edge of a truth that could either bring them closer or tear them apart, and neither of them knew which way it would go. As the days turned into weeks, the city outside the penthouse seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the storm brewing between them. The rain continued to fall, a constant reminder of the night that had brought them together. But as Alexander looked at Mia, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the city lights, he knew one thing for certain. No matter what they discovered, no matter how painful the truth might be, he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Because she was his daughter, and for the first time in his life, that meant more to him than anything else. But as the shadows of the past closed in, one question remained unanswered. What had really happened to Elena? And what did it mean for the future they were trying to build? The answers were out there, waiting to be found. But finding them would come at a cost, one that neither of them could yet imagine.